whilst there's not been a sort of major breach or a sort of loss event in major financial services businesses in Australia, I think as APRA points out, this shouldn't lead us to be complacent. I think most of the clients that we work with see this as one of their top 3 risks and continue to be focused on uplifting their capability and responding to the changes in the threats that they see against their businesses. I think specifically in FS, there's a focus on the new prudential standard that's been released by APRA, CPS 234, and there's investments focused or refocused on enabling compliance with that, which in our minds is a good thing because the requirements of CPS 234 are aligned with good practice, with industry good practice, and therefore are enabling businesses to invest in the right sort of cyber strategies. There's a big focus around detection and response, so based upon the assumption that at some point organisations will be breached, and therefore there's a need for them to be able to respond and recover quickly and efficiently to be able to deal with that. As soon as you're interacting and enabling sort of digital capabilities within your business, then you're exposing yourself, you're exposing your systems and data to sort of cyber criminals and to actors who seek to get value from that information and from those systems. So they typically are utilising sort of spray and pray type tactics and techniques, whether they're phishing emails or phishing campaigns that are pretty general. They're not particularly sophisticated, but they do in some instances get through, and some malware is enabled on computers. They also take advantage of weaknesses in us as consumers. So using individuals' email accounts and so on, compromising those and using those to commit the CEO or payment frauds, where they purport to act on behalf of businesses who are interacting with other businesses to change banking details and so on in payments. The sort of more advanced attacks are where we're seeing the cyber criminals, and these are the ones that most FS businesses are concerned with and focus on most of their time. And that's where they're utilising sort of more sophisticated techniques and tools that are available for rent, or to buy on the dark web, and they're typically targeted towards an organisation. They include exploitation of vulnerabilities, both sort of known and also some zero-day exploits where they've not been exposed or communicated to software vendors. And we saw some examples of that through it's been publicly stated about the Equifax breach in 2017. That was related to a zero-day defect on a Struts sort of library, which is a sort of common software library that was able to be exploited and was an initial entry point. The sort of emerging attacks are by definition changing and evolving over time, and this is where there are more sophisticated techniques that layer a series of those capabilities, and they include, we're seeing an increase in sort of deception capabilities where attackers are using additional capabilities to be able to deceive responders by deliberately laying sort of breadcrumbs to point the responders on a off the scent effectively of what they're trying to achieve. And that takes up time, energy and resource in focusing on the wrong things, enabling the attackers to continue their work in stealing information and data. So they would be the sort of best examples, I think, of some of the techniques that we're seeing. I think that historically, the banks have seen the biggest investment in cybersecurity because of the obvious targeting of their payment systems, the information financial and PII information, as well as clearly the deposits that they have within them. And we do continue to see the banks probably investing the majority of resources around cybersecurity. However, in the last probably 2 to 3 years, the insurance industry is certainly been investing significantly in uplifting their capabilities in being able to resist and respond to attacks. And I think we've now seen through the release of APRA's CPS 234 prudential standard, a sort of broadening of that base and investment around information security. So I think APRA was very focused on trying to uplift the broader financial services community and their capabilities to resist and defend against cyber attacks. And we've certainly seen that play out in the market where a number of, the smaller financial services businesses, whether they're smaller asset managers, whether they're small insurers or superannuation businesses, are certainly now making significant investments in protecting their customer data and their intellectual property and so on. Deadline for compliance is the 1st of July 2019, and I think what we're seeing is that it's not, it's a principle-based regulation. It's not prescriptive. It's not like what we've seen with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, where there's a lot more descriptive nature of what's required to comply. And that's sort of both good and bad. It's good in the sense that there's no right or wrong answer. Effectively, APRA's asking and is demanding from businesses that they're more disciplined and structured in terms of how in their investments that they're making to protect their key assets. And they're really asking you to understand your threats, your key assets, and what's required in between those to be able to protect assets from those threats. Our point of view is that there's sort of 5 key areas that businesses will need to focus on in order to comply. So first and foremost is around roles and responsibilities, including with the board. And that's about having clear accountabilities for information security within the organisation. And that is important in smaller organisations where there may be some material outsourcing of their IT systems to IT service providers and so on. But it's also requiring the board to be more explicit in their demand for information to support the risk-based decisions they're making around investments and management's investments in information security. So number 2, that organisations maintain security capabilities that are commensurate with the threat. And what that really is saying is you need to understand the types of threats that are going to be targeting your business. And that's different depending upon whether you are an asset manager or a superannuation business, a bank, a regional bank, or a major financial institution that does a range of things. So understanding your threats and the types of scenarios that those threats will play out in terms of impacts to your business then allows you to be clear around the types of capabilities that you require. So we've seen organisations making investments, but being clear around the link of those investments to the threats it hasn't necessarily been there in many businesses. There's more of a sense of security obtained through actually doing something, actually making some investments. So maintaining capabilities commensurate with threat, number 2. Number 3 is around understanding your critical assets. And that's critical information assets. I think where we would in most of our customers, there's still I would say an evolving capability around understanding what it is that you most need to protect. And that sounds simple to say, but it's harder to be able to identify in the larger the organisation is. Number 4 is around notification of any incidents or material control weaknesses that you're unable to remediate within a timely manner. And that does require some changes internally to be able to understand that there's been an incident or a control weakness and that information's able to be fed back through APRA. And then lastly, there's a focus on third parties. So I mentioned before, smaller organisations have outsourced significant chunks of their capability, their IT capability, to IT service providers. APRA's is requiring that businesses actually still take accountability for those controls, even if they're not being implemented and operated by themselves. So we've seen an uplift in the focus on the controls that exist and are operated by third parties, and that's having a sort of ripple effect beyond financial services into a range of service providers. Clearly, the standard itself has over 30 sort of detailed paragraphs describing requirements from a compliance point of view. But that's not the only lens through which to view the scope that you need to focus on in order to be able to sort of remediate and demonstrate compliance from July 1st. So we sort of recommend a sort of multi-lens view. So number one is those requirements. Number two is actually looking at your organisational structure. So one of the references in the standard is to not just the sort of main entity, but also to subsidiaries and also to on a global basis. So understanding your organisational structure and what therefore is within the scope of your compliance obligations is really important, because that again isn't as simple as it sounds. So when you're going, there's a lot of merger and acquisition activity in place at the moment in the life insurance business specifically, and that's causing some headaches in working out who's accountable for compliance at certain times through those transactions, as an example. Number three, threats. Understanding the threats to your business and using those as the basis of determining the capabilities that you require. And then number four is around assets. If you had 500 critical assets, that drives a significant scale in terms of the requirement for you to understand the control states and remediate any control weaknesses that might exist. Whereas if you have 5 or 10 or 50 critical assets, then that job is clearly a lot simpler. So getting organisations to focus on an appropriate set of critical assets is really important to be able to manage the scope. And then lastly, third parties. Getting a handle on the third parties that have access to your information, your critical information assets, or that operate controls on those information assets helps you then understand the scope of the compliance activity that you need to undertake in understanding the state of controls of those third parties. Whilst I wouldn't necessarily agree that they will all experience a significant cybersecurity incident, I think they all need to act as if it could happen to them, and therefore it is an appropriate basis on which to be planning your activities around cybersecurity and your ability to resist and defend attacks. So one area where it's almost low-hanging fruit in terms of it doesn't take a significant investment, but is able to have an impact on your ability to minimise the impact of any cyber incident is the sort of respond and recover elements of cybersecurity. And we see organisations not just building plans, but actually building the muscle memory to enact those plans should there be an incident. So executing cyber drills and practicing simulations of a particular type of incident, and ensuring that those drills include not just the technical security folks, but also include the likes of the crisis management teams, the teams that are going to need to deal with a decision around when do they notify their customers in the case of a major data breach, how do they deal with their regulators, how they're going to deal with media queries, and so on, which we have seen time and again, done correctly, done appropriately, and done confidently, are able to minimise the impacts to businesses that may have been impacted by a cyber incident. So if organisations aren't doing some of those things, then to me that's a simpler area to focus on to ensure that you're prepared and ready to deal with it. Clearly, preventing attacks is the best form of defence, but we know that if sophisticated attackers are really targeting an organisation, it's very, very hard to resist them completely. So being able to detect, respond and recover is really important.
Marriott was the biggest data breach of 2018. Something like 5 million unencrypted passport numbers stolen there, 8.6 million credit card details, lots of other personal information, 380 million people affected. So a big attack. And actually in that one, it was the Starwood database that was compromised. Marriott bought Starwood in 2016. But the attack had gone on between 2014 and 2018. So I think there's a big lesson there in terms of due diligence on an acquisition. Often when we do due diligence on acquisitions, we're very focused on the financial due diligence, the cultural fit and all of these other things. But what about cybersecurity? And there's certainly an argument that if you're bringing a company in to your organization and it has weaker cyber controls than you do, you effectively drop down to their level of cyber maturity. So I think there is a need to really apply a cyber lens to acquisitions and to due diligence. Some other hygiene factors in those data breaches you mentioned. Patching is a very important one. That's what underlay the Equifax breach, for example. They didn't patch a system for which there was a known fix, if you like, and that's what the hackers exploited to take 143 million Americans' details. And the House Oversight Committee in America was very critical of the level of patching in that particular instance. There are other technologies that can be used as well. Data loss prevention technology. I mean, you can nowadays program systems to monitor for certain types of data leaving the organization. So you could program it to say, this is what a passport number looks like. You know, if I see one of those exiting the perimeter, then block it. So I think, you know, keeping aware of the technology, making sure you do the right level of due diligence, but also getting the basics right, you know, particularly in respect of patching, I think can take you a long way to preventing an incident like the ones you mentioned. Those standards have driven a lot of activity in the financial services market in Australia. You know, mandatory breach, which came in February 2018, I think really got companies to focus on their incident response processes, because of course you now have to notify the Information Commissioner in Australia if you suffered a breach that's likely to cause significant harm. So a lot of investment into, you know, how do we know we've been attacked? What do we do once we've been attacked, which I think is very positive. GDPR as well has created a lot of investment and a lot of uplift in cyber maturity in Australia, particularly some of the more onerous requirements around GDPR. For example, the need to be able to delete a customer's data if they ask you to do that. That's not easy. You have to know where all the data is. You then have to be able to delete it. And so a lot of organizations have spent good time and money investing in cyber uplift as a result of those regulations. And I know we at EY have seen a big increase in our privacy work, in our incident response work, in our digital law work as a result of those regulations, and CPS 234 as well, of course, in the financial services sector here. There's also been recent kind of global praise for GDPR. The UK government last week came out and said that cyber breaches were actually declining in the UK, and they attributed that to GDPR. Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook CEO, Facebook arguably has the biggest sort of trove of personal data in the world. He's very complimentary about GDPR in a press release last week. So I think these global regulations are driving uplift in organizations' cyber maturity, which is kind of what we need and what we want. There is a great variability by sector in terms of cyber maturity in Australia. The banks in particular lead the way. You know, they've had good, well-funded cyber security uplift programs in place for between 5 and 10 years, and were the first to adopt the role of Chief Information Security Officer, for example. We now see lots of other sectors following suit, power and utilities in particular, driven by regulation, as well as a need to protect critical national infrastructure, government driven by policy, and and companies even in the sort of mining and metals and consumer product space, driven by the health and safety of automated manufacturing and so on, autonomous vehicles and what have you. So I think there has been a significant increase in the awareness of boards around this topic. Most organizations, large organizations now consider cyber to be a top 3 risk. And I think boards have been driven by some of that regulation, GDPR, CPS 234, mandatory breach notification. They've been driven by activities such as ASIC's survey of the ASX 100 in 2017, which was conducted by the chair of the Audit Risk Committee in terms of a company's particular posture around cyber. And they've been driven by a recognition that they've got a fiduciary responsibility around cybersecurity, particularly to the extent that it could have a material effect on the financial statements. And we see that when boards get the bug around cyber and they apply pressure to executive management, that's when real change happens in organizations. It's really difficult to improve your cyber maturity if it's a bottom-up approach from somewhere in a kind of technology middle management position. But when the board kind of applies pressure to the organization, that's when significant change happens. So I would encourage board members to be more focused on their questions around cybersecurity and demand regular reporting on it, because that will result in safer organizations here in Australia.